That is the sound of Fresh Outlook. Hello to all of our viewers here in the U.S. and abroad. I'm Mia Toschi. We're going to begin today's show with a look into a piece of American history. Now, many of our younger viewers watching may never have heard of the Freedom Summer. During that summer in 1964, civil rights workers challenged the state of Mississippi as to why African Americans were not allowed to vote, get a decent education, and hold elected office. Well, this week marks the 50th anniversary. The Mississippi Freedom Summer's 50th anniversary conference is now convening in Jackson to recognize the accomplishments of those courageous fighters who helped bring significant changes to the state. Let's have a look and talk it out.
In June 1964, the Freedom Summer began where volunteers attempted to register as many African American voters in Mississippi. Students, leaders, and organizations such as MCHR, Medical Committee for Human Rights, and NAACP Legal Defense Funding, Inc. Fund, from the North went down south to lend support to Mississippians during the 10 weeks. Unfortunately, violence ensued during the Freedom Summers, mainly because the local white residents did not want outsiders to change their society. The views of these Southerners led to the harassment and beatings of volunteers, churches and homes being burned, and arrests as well as murder. 3 men, James Chaney, who was a local resident, Corps organizer Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, a summer volunteer, were all arrested. Upon their release, they were ambushed by members of the Ku Klux Klan who abducted them and killed them. The incident drew massive media attention, and the FBI was called in to investigate. Their deaths led to the first successful federal prosecution of a civil rights case in Mississippi. Although the Freedom Summer was not that successful, that summer of 1964 did impact the future of civil rights movement.
This nation will rise.
To talk more about this historic week, we are joined by my co-host and former White House aide Dee Dee Benkie, who is also a history major, we might add. We also have with us today Reverend Forrest Pritchett. He is the program director of the Dr. Martin Luther King Leadership Program. And W.E. DaCruz, also from the Leadership Program, and we welcome you both and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mia.
Thank you.
Well, we want to start off with exactly, what this demonstration and this summer was all about, and just take a look back at history, because a lot of younger folks and a lot of the younger audience may not really understand. So, Dr. Pritchett, we're going to let you take the history lesson, if you will.
Well, as briefly as possible, I'd like to start several years earlier with the brutal murder of the young man from Chicago who was visiting relatives in Alabama. And with his brutal death, Rosa Parks was then committed to really sitting down on behalf of that history. Anyway, that gave birth also to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC. I was starting college myself in 1961, and shortly after arriving on campus, many of us had a sit-in demonstration. But SNCC began to become the college student involvement part of the civil rights movement. As we were moving toward the fall of '63, the youngest president in American history and the only Roman Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. We began to think that indeed we had better step our game up. A plan was developed by Robert Moses, a graduate of Hamilton College, to have thousands of college students go into Mississippi during the summer of '64 to do 2 things. We started 40 leadership schools, freedom leadership schools, in which we empowered all of the sharecroppers to understand their rights and to demand representation.
It must have been a very proud feeling, though, to go back and look back at the accomplishments that a lot of these folks made on American history.
Yes.
But also, when you look back and we think about terrorism today, this was really homegrown terrorism.
Except we just didn't call it that. It was just the way things were being done.
But just really, when you look at it, some of the numbers, 37 churches were burned just in 10 weeks, 4 civil rights workers were killed. Just when you look back on that, I mean, it was just such a horrific time in history, but it is important to teach young people that.
You know, I think the difference now from back then is that our young people or this generation, we don't understand the importance of community, which is really just common unity. When you look at the word, when you look at SNCC and other organizations like CORE, they were truly a community. That's why they went from the north to the south to lend a hand to those in voters registration. I think we lack that nowadays, especially young people, and so there's no conversation amongst us as to what happened then, what we can do about it, and I think that's why we are kind of limited in our action, because there's just no conversation, there's no community.
Well, we do want to talk more about that. I also want to talk about how some in the black and white community have come together, and Dee Dee, you were explaining that earlier to me.
Yeah, really an incredible week, and it's amazing how history does repeat itself. Now, obviously not the terrible things happened this week that happened in the beginning, but as you're referring to. However, the black and white community came together because Thad Cochran, who is the U.S. Senator from Mississippi, he was reelected, and he was losing initially, and then they did a runoff, and it was the black pastors in a black community that crossed over. They're Democrats, they crossed over, mostly anyway, to the race, and they beat the Tea Party candidate, because the Tea Party candidate was, we'll say, racially insensitive at the very least. Some would say more, but really the community did not feel comfortable with him, so they crossed over and helped Thad Cochran. So now he was a U.S. Senator, and that's the power of the community coming together, and that's what happened. So history in a sense repeated itself this week.
Now, Wendy, I do agree with you, though. I think that there certainly much more needs to be done, and when we look back 50 years later, even though this is a great example that Dee Dee just gave us, there is still a great deal to do, and it's always amazing to me that the Ku Klux Klan is still in existence.
Yeah.
New Jersey has historically, unfortunately, also been the home to the Klan, the northern portions of the Klan, and many of us are making an observation over 50 years. We have seen American racism go from simply being very explicit in the 20th century to being a bit more implicit today.
And I can certainly add a little bit about my own when I was down in reporting for Hurricane Katrina.
Yes.
You couldn't believe the discrimination that was still very alive. Very saddened to see
Yes.
that. When you look back 50 years, Reverend, does it sadden you that we haven't come even further? Or are you, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of proud moments of how far we've come and
Very
how many
proud
accomplishments have been made. But where would you like to see things in another 50 years?
Well, I'll start by indicating during that summer specifically, as a member of SNCC, rather than going to Mississippi, I returned to my hometown, Atlantic City, to assist with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and Fannie Lou Hamer, who were coming into Atlantic City. I think about that moment of freedom that was realized at the convention. Now I look at the 21st century with the re-election of Barack Obama, and I know how many states are now attempting to literally revert to that old mentality when it comes to voting rights. And it saddens us a little bit, but it even makes me a little more energized when I think we have to begin to train up the next generation of civil rights leaders to be effective.
And you work with the Martin Luther King, not foundation, I'm sorry.
Leadership
program. Tell me what the goals of the program are.
Well, the leadership program is really a full tuition scholarship program, or at least when I was entering freshman year, that allowed us to build community amongst other people who were just as enthused about education and career aspirations. So the leadership program at Seton Hall is a great foundation. We come together, we put on multiple programs throughout the year on various topics just to spread awareness. And I think what's most important about the leadership program is it gets us into conversations that we otherwise wouldn't have had if we didn't have leaders like Reverend Pritchett, who is the program director. It really forces us to become conscious about what's happening in present day, as well as look back to our past and see how far we've come and what else there is to do. So right now, as a graduate of the leadership program, I serve more as a mentor to those who are coming in and just helping them to get adjusted to the college campus.
And certainly the Freedom Summer, the goals are very much the same.
Yes.
Education.
Empowerment, equipping, and so forth.
And if you had like one dream, I had a dream. If you had a dream right now, Reverend, what would that be?
Every man, woman, and child in America could live out their God-given gifts in dignity, respect, and in full participation with the principles of democracy.
And I think that's a good question for everybody. So Dee Dee, I'll ask you the same question. You know, when we look back and on history this week. If you could start off with what your dream.
Well, you know, I think that I would like for everyone to vote. I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. I mean, I'm obviously a strong Republican, but I really want everyone to vote. And a lot of people don't. It's amazing the small percentage of Americans that are elected officials. So everybody out there, go register to vote.
And I think it's a great
important
point, because you forget about, you know, the people that lived and died for the rights of people to vote, and then you see such lackadaisical.
Well, worse than that, in the 60s, they wouldn't let blacks vote, and then women couldn't vote. I mean, you know, for someone to not be able to vote is absolutely ridiculous at this point, and people need to understand that it's so important. That's what gives us our liberty, is our right to vote.
But as you said, you're a staunch Republican.
Yes.
But in terms of when you do see just this mediocrity where people aren't, we certainly saw a lot of people go out and vote with Obama, and there seemed to be a little re-energizing.
I think that's good, though. I mean, look,
with the young people.
For someone to get energized about a candidate, that is very, very good for all of America.
Let me also ask you, in terms of, you know, we saw Obama, how he re-energized everything and brought a lot of the black and white community together. Was that a very proud moment for you as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. It reminded me of the words of Dr. King when he envisioned that time in the future, in which he said, I might not even get there with you, much like Moses in the Promised Land. He said, but indeed, I guess when you get there, act like you deserve that moment. And I think that's what I would carry forward.
Now, I have a question that we were talking about when you were waiting in what we call the green room, everybody. That's where we put our wonderful guests like yourself. And I was explaining to you that I have a young nephew, and what we were going to be doing on television today and speaking about in the Freedom Summer. And I said, yes, it used to be that it was whites and coloreds. And he could not believe that African-American folks were called colored, and he was absolutely floored by that.
Yes.
And the same thing goes with some folks right now will say, well, the African-American community doesn't want to be called that, and we were talking about Latino and Hispanic, but just the changes just in, and just if you could maybe just explain that.
Sure. Well, really, since the 1400s in this country, the African-American population has been called by many names. Most of those names, they never generated themselves. So it really showed that societal control over the identity and fate of the Negro population, who then evolved to become the black population. And then we were Afro-Americans before we became African-Americans. I think it was Jesse Jackson in the 1980s who suggested that, like many other immigrant groups to the country or ethnic populations who may be Italian-American, Portuguese-American.
Sure.
That may be time that we identify with a country of origin, even though many of us had never been there. So that's where we get to the phrase of African-American. So studying the history of ethnic identification in America is a subject really to its own in terms of how that happens, because it happens differently for various groups. For example, when I mention the name Cesar Chavez today to young people, many think it's a boxer or the president of a South American country. And I'm really talking about
and yet it's
a guy on the West Coast who organized lettuce workers.
That's right, and yet it's a state holiday in Colorado, Texas, and California.
Yes, indeed.
And a lot of people aren't aware of that. But there's a. I was amazed to hear that my nephew had absolutely no idea about that part of history. We're just going to get some final thoughts about. There's going to be a large group of folks down in Mississippi, and what they're actually going to be doing, and just tell us what they're going to be doing as they celebrate the 50th anniversary.
About a year ago, SNCC actually conducted its 50th year anniversary of becoming an organization. This year, we have going on at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. A celebration where many of those who are still alive are talking about and analyzing what we did, how we did it. Simultaneous to that, we have a youth convention going on where we are preparing that next generation of, hopefully, of leaders.
Yeah. And Wendy, I can't agree with you more about the community and the lack thereof community in so many parts. Sometimes don't know if it's because of the electronics today or what the reason is, but I certainly agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a shift in consciousness, but like Reverend Pritchett was saying, this youth convention that's occurring in Mississippi, it's just a great step forward to get the elders and the younger generation talking again and getting back into action. So I think it's just a wonderful opportunity.
Well, we thank you so much for your time here, and we commend you for all of your efforts to educate our young people.
Thank you.
Wendy and Reverend Pritchett from Seton Hall University.